In this video, I'll look at bounce lighting in Mental Ray. I've called up my render setup by pressing F10, and under the production render, I've reassigned NVIDIA Mental Ray as the production. Now go to the indirect illumination. What we've done so far is simply turn on Final Gather, which is the bouncing and regathering of indirect light in the scene. It's pretty decent so far, but I'd like to add a little more glow and a little more softness to it. One of the first things I'll do is kick up the number of diffuse bounces. As we can see here by the tooltip that pops up, we want to have more bounces in there for a softer look, 4 to 7. I'll try 4 and see how this behaves, keeping in mind that with every increase in diffuse bounces, I'm taking a hit in render time. I'll make sure that my render is sized down in the common parameters for testing, and I'll click Render and see what I get. As we can see here in the render as it develops, the scene is brighter looking and softer overall because of those diffuse bounces. Now there's some other quality I can play with to make sure that the light really has a chance to bounce around the scene well. It looks pretty good, so I'll cancel this render as I have a good idea of how it's heading. I'll also make sure as part of rendering that I spin the camera around. I'll click on the Orbit Camera button down in the bottom right in the viewport navigation. Click and drag and hold Shift so I drag on the horizontal. I'll spin around and then dolly back using the Dolly Camera tool and make sure I take a look all the way around the space. I'll click Render one more time and see how this behaves. So far everything looks pretty good, but occasionally I've been surprised because it looks good one way and in another it's rather odd. I can tell already from the Final Gather it's doing pretty well. So far the renderer looks good in this direction, so I feel comfy now making some adjustments to the Final Gather. I'll cancel this as I have a pretty good idea of how it's going to lay out. In the Mental Ray renderer, under Indirect Illumination, we have our Final Gatherer controls. We've softened the rendering by adding in some bounces, but now we can play with the amount of Final Gather and its quality. Right now, it's got a low accuracy, meaning I may see some blotching in some scenes depending on how the light is playing in. But I can interpolate this. Interpolating smooths out that possible blotchiness, allowing me to have a shorter render time by keeping those Final Gather points low. What I can also do is play with a preset. There's Draft, Low, Medium, and High, and each one comes with a corresponding increase in render time. I'll keep it at Draft for now, because I like the way it's looking, but I'll play with the multiplier. What this lets us do then is say, not only is it lit, but the bounce light has some extra power if we want, and a color bias. I'll try it with a multiplier at 2 and render a region to see how this looks. I'll pull the region into somewhere that's rendered already, and hit Render. We can see in this region render that the section I've rendered is much brighter. I'm almost losing the detail on these columns that help support the ticket booth roof. What I can do in here is, aside from the multiplier, put a color in. What this does is tint the Final Gather, the bounce light. For example, I might introduce in a little bit of a blue to counteract that strong warmth I've got going everywhere. Now when I hit Render, it'll tint that Final Gather. What I'd also like to do, in conjunction with tinting the Final Gather, is lower the exposure. I'll press 8 to go to the Environment and Effects dialog and scroll down to my photographic exposure controls. Right now what we can see is we have an exposure value of 6, which is pretty good, although it may be letting a lot of light in. If I increase this number, we can see that the shutter speed changes and the aperture and ISO stay the same. As I bring this up though, we can start to see the image behind getting darker. We're actually seeing or letting less light in. When I click Render then, I'm going to get a much darker image. And I can balance in here the luminous feel of the bounce light, the intensity of my lights, and how much light that camera is letting in. This may be actually too dark, as I can already see here from the Final Gather, that somewhere in the middle is probably pretty good. If you have a good command of your photographic exposure, you can really stylize an image. I'll play with this as well. I'll switch over from an exposure value to a photographic, and I'll run a film ISO of 200. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the film is to light, and hence shows the image as brighter. We use 100 on the inside, 200 for inside and outside, and 400 and 800 for outdoor shots. The aperture then, f-stop, tells us how much light we're letting in through the opening based on how big the opening in the lens is. I'll pull this down, maybe an f4, letting more light in as we can see my scene getting brighter. And then I'll increase the shutter speed. Right now it's a quarter second, which is actually very, very slow. Things will blur very much if you use a quarter second exposure. What I'll do is bring this up, maybe to a 24th of a second, so my scene dims back and I can brighten up my lights if needed. I'll try a slightly larger region render and see how this looks and adjust that final gather further. This is working much better. Yes, the scene is definitely dimmer, but I've got some relief back in my objects, and the blue in the final gather, plus the increased multiplier, is countering that hot, bright, luminous feel just a little bit, and instead bringing back that warmth and softness I wanted. Now if I need, I can play with my lights and brighten them up. But I'll look at the indirect illumination one more time. Once we're also ready for a rendering, we can increase this final gather precision, and we may need it to avoid flickering between frames. What we can do also is drop this down and do positions along a camera path, interpolating final gather back and forth to get an optimized final gather so our render doesn't flicker. Additionally, we can reuse the geometry if we'd like. That way we freeze that, load it once, and then reload a referenced file instead of recalculating it. If we'd like, we can do the same with final gather if nothing is moving in the scene. I think this looks pretty good. I'll try one more tweak of a multiplier of 3 and see how this looks. It's working nicely. What I can already tell is that the blue in there combined with the multiplier is muting down some of the orange in the colors. Yes, your color theory work does apply here. What it's giving me then is that flatness and softness I expect in the render, without being garish in color, yet still maintaining that vibrancy of Art Deco. It's got a warmth and a softness to the scene, and I'm ready for any final tweaks in my lighting, and anything else I'd like to do in terms of shadows or quality.